Once you've installed and configured the groov.io node package, you may want to start doing more substantial things with your data. If you haven't already installed these nodes and set up a localhost device, go ahead and watch our previous video that goes over that process down in the description below. In this video, I'll be using these nodes to bring in data of two different types and logging it to a MySQL database that I'm also going to show you how to install, set up, and get started with. Now, before I dive into installing and configuring the MySQL side of things, I first want to understand the data that I'm bringing into Node-RED. I'll also need to know the data type, module index, and channel index of that data on this groov RIO before I can even see it in Node-RED. So, I'll start by going up to Groov Manage and selecting I/O channels. You can see here I have a lot of options. The first one I'm going to bring in is this top button. You can see if I reach over to my RIO and toggle that button on, it goes on, and it will stay on until I press it again, and there we go, it turns off. I don't want to log this every couple of seconds because it might sit there and be off for, say, an hour or even 10 hours. So instead, I'm only going to log this data when it changes. The other piece of data I want to bring in is this oven temperature right here. That's just this small temperature probe that I have next to me, and if I grab it with my hand, you can see it'll go from 80 degrees and slowly start increasing the longer I hold onto it. This one here is on analog input 3. And you can see that there, channel 3 at the top there. Because I'm using a groov RIO, there's only one module, and that has the module index of 0. But you can confirm that up in the URL as well. You can see we're on IO, module 0, channel 3, and we're looking at the status of that point. So, the top button on digital input 0, and then analog input from number 3. This analog value we're going to log every 5 seconds or so I have a really nice, consistent historical record of what the temperature has been, even if it doesn't fluctuate very much. These are just two typical ways of storing data into a database, so we'll get started with them. So, back in my Node-RED, I'll come down, and yes, I do want to be on the digital state change with my module index of 0, and that top button was there on the channel index of 0 as well. Lastly, I'll give this node a name like read button. Nice and simple. Now I'll click done, press and hold left control on my keyboard and left click in the workspace, and I can just quickly drop in a debug node so I can see this message.payload. I know that I want to be watching message.payload because if I click on this node and come over to the help tab, we'll see that the outputs are in fact payload for the value that's read in for any given type. So I know I'm good to go, everything's configured, let's wire that in, switch to the debug pane, and deploy. We'll see right away I've gotten my initial value of false. If I come over here and press the button, right away I get a message saying it's true, and if I press again, there we go, it's gone false, it's toggled back off. So that's my first piece of data. Let's quickly look at the second piece of data before we move on. Rather than having the temperature be inputted when it changes, I'm going to want to regularly read it, whether it changes or not. So I'll drag in that groov.io read node, which needs to be triggered by an input. For that, I'll just, again, press and hold left control and left click on the screen, because all I need to do is add an inject node. I'll show you how to configure this a little bit more later, let's just get it tested for starters. So, I'll wire that into my groov.io read node and double click that to configure it. You'll notice that I don't need to reset up my localhost device, it's saved it, and I'm using the same one as I was with the digital input. However, I'm not reading a digital channel, I'm reading an analog channel, and that's on module 0 and channel index 3. Finally, I'll give this node a name like read temperature, and click done. Now, when I left click and add in a new debug here, we'll again see the value come up over here in the debug pane. So let's clear that up and deploy. We'll get that button value come through again, and every time we inject here, we should see the number of the temperature. And there we go, there's our first value. And there's another one. But I don't want to be clicking on this timestamp node every single time I want a reading. I want it to happen regularly, so that's what I'm going to use this repeat option for at the bottom here. I'll just set it to be an interval, and let's start with something a little bit longer, say 15 seconds, 4 measurements every minute. In real life, you might want something a lot shorter than this, every second or half a second, or maybe something much longer, for example, once every hour if you just need really coarse data. Keep in mind that the more often you inject into the database, the more quickly it will fill up, so just be mindful of what you need versus what the cost is. So now I'll click done, and that's the groov side of things taken care of. Now let's get started with MySQL. Now, before I go on, it's important to note that you will need a gateway to the internet in order to download new node packages. Here, I'm connected over Ethernet to my local router, so I'm able to come up into the top right menu and select Manage Palette. This is where I'm able to install new nodes. So I'll just come over to the Install tab and do my search, MySQL, and we'll grab this top package here, that's the one I'm looking for, Node-RED-Node-MySQL. So I'll select Install, confirm the installation, and then to make sure everything comes down correctly, I'll select View Log. We can see here, I removed it earlier, but I'm just reinstalling it so that you can see what happens. You'll see, depending on the version of Node-RED you're running and the version of the node, you may get some warnings here. But what we're looking for is this return code of 0 and a green pop-up showing that the nodes have been added to our palette, and we'll know we're good to go. And there we go. After just a couple of seconds of waiting, we've gotten that return code of 0, the green pop-up saying the nodes have been added to our palette, so I can close out of all this, and we'll see under the storage section, I have this new MySQL node. So let's drag that in and configure it. I'll double click it and see that I have to add a new database. There isn't one by default. Now, I already have a database set up for the purposes of this video, but you'll need to contact either your IT admins or get a database administrator or do some Googling and set one up for yourself. But in this case, I can select the pencil icon and start filling in the details for my particular server. You won't be able to access it since it is secure with a username and password, so just keep that in mind. First thing is the host name. Mine is running locally on my network, 192.254.25. You could be running it locally on your own network, or you could be using a cloud service, for example, AWS. The default port 3306 is how I have my database configured, but again, just consult the person that manages your database before you go through this process. I'll put in my username, which I'm going to use the root account, and my password. It's very important you specify which database you want to access, because an entire database server can have multiple smaller databases, and then each database can have multiple tables. We'll see where the table gets put in later. In my case, it's simply called dev, since I'm showing it on this dev channel. There is a default time zone, but if you want to put something more specific there, that's okay. And again, I'm going to leave it as the default character set. There's a little bit more information about this node. If you click on the Help tab, you can see that what the time zone options can be set and what the character options are. Finally, I'll give this a name like Developer Database, and click Add. That's all I need to do, and I only need to do it once to be able to access my developer database. So now we'll click Done, and I need to know what tables I have available to me. I've already set a table up, but again, please check out with your IT or database team, and they'll be able to get this figured out. To show you the things I've already got set up here, I'm going to use some really simple transact SQL or TSQL commands. I'm not going to go into too much detail of how this TSQL syntax works, but I will go over the basics so that you can get started. So let's select this database node and come over to the Help tab to see how it works. We can see here that message.topic must hold the query, and then the result will come back in message.payload. So let's go ahead and come up here and drop in a new inject node, wire that in, and we'll configure it. Here we can see we are able to set the topic right here in the node, and we'll use our basic command to see what's in this database we've selected, this dev database. So what we want to do is we want to do show tables, and that's going to show us the tables that are in the database. With TSQL, you have to end every command with a semicolon. That's how it knows to actually execute what you're asking. So I'll click Done, and you can see that right there on my inject node. So I'll drop in another debug node and wire that in. But if we come over to my debug pane, we'll see that we've been getting that temperature reading pretty regularly, and we don't need to see that right now, so let's just quiet these other debug nodes up. We don't have to delete them, we'll just quiet them down for now. Now I'll clear up my debug log and select deploy. We can see right away our database node is saying that we're connected. If I come over here and inject, it'll make that select, and we'll see we're getting 2 items in array back. The first one is a C-store, a convenience store table that we'll use in a future video for more dynamic applications with MySQL. And then we've also got this management table, which is where we're going to be logging our temperature and this button turning on and off. This could signify something like when the store opens or closes, and only management needs to know about that. We also may only want to know the temperature over a long period of time. So again, we're going to be using this management table for both. So now we need to better understand this management table. Let's come back over to the inject node and change this command. We'll ask it to describe that table. And again, ending that command with a semicolon. So now when I click Done, I can deploy, and when I click this node, we'll see I get these objects back. Each of these items describes one column in that database. For example, we have an ID that can automatically increment, so that way we don't have to actually fill it out. It'll just keep track of entry 1, entry 2, entry 3, and it'll uniquely identify each entry. We also have a time field that we can hand in, the actual data that is going to be either the temperature or the button going on and off, and then finally we need to know which employee opened or closed the store or was there while the temperature was being logged. So now that I know all of these details, I can start actually inserting some data into my database. Now, keep in mind that you don't have to go through this process in Node-RED. I just wanted to show you what it looked like. Let's have a look at it from a database command line side of things. This is what your IT or database administrator might be able to provide to you as well. So I'll come over here and we'll see I've got a command line that's talking to my MariaDB or MySQL equivalent database here. The first thing I need to do is make sure that I'm using the developer database. As you can see, it says none right there. So I'll type in usedev again with that all-important semicolon. So now we can see I've changed my database and I can type in my command describe management. And here we go. It's exactly the same as what I saw in Node-RED. We've got our auto incrementing ID, then the time, data, and employee. Also note that time is an integer because we're going to be putting a timestamp in here. We'll come to that soon. So now back in Node-RED, we're ready to start actually writing our command. I'm going to be doing this with a function node, and you can see those up here in the function section. Now, you don't have to use a function node. There are other ways to define what your insert statement is going to be, but I like it because it gives you some really powerful tools to modify your data a little bit, and you can just throw all the text together at the end and assign that to the message.topic. That will be your insert statement. So I'm going to bring open this function node and start writing out what I need. So the first thing I need is not this ID, it's in fact the time. So I'm going to bring in a raw time value and then we'll change that in a little bit. The next thing I need is the data, and that's going to be our message.payload. And we're also going to need the employee. And that, in this case, is just going to be RIO dev, the host name of this device. But you could change that to be whatever you needed. One other quirk is that because these are character sets, I do need to have single ticks inside of those quotes. These ticks are really important when you're working with these varchar strings with databases. That's because the database needs to know that this is actually a value and not part of some other command. And so those values are going to be defined by these single ticks around them. So yes, that does in fact mean we'll need to put some around our message.payload as well. You can just use double quotes to separate the different type of string, and then add that to the front of the payload, and then do the same on the other side. Little typo there, but that's okay, it's easy to fix. Now all we need to do is figure out what our time value is. So in this case, I'm going to be using a new date object, and I'm going to get the time from this value. Now, the raw time.getTime is going to give me nanoseconds when I actually need milliseconds. Now, if you can work with nanoseconds, that's fine. You can just insert your raw data. But I'm going to show you a little trick on how I can get it down into seconds. So I'm going to create a new time variable, and I'm going to take that raw time, and I'm going to divide it by 1000. Now, that's going to essentially cut it down and get rid of those last 4 digits and just give me my seconds, but it's also going to be as a fraction. So the last thing I'm going to do is round that down to only get the first integer values, because I am in fact inserting time into an integer field. So now I have all my individual pieces of data put together. You could have collected them in a different way, but the important thing is that they're all in here now. So now, finally, we have our insert statement. This is going to use some new transact SQL syntax, but it's pretty straightforward. You just say insert into, and then what you do is you define the table that you're inserting into, in this case, management. Then you say which columns you want to write to, so we're skipping over ID because that'll automatically increment itself, but we do want to insert this time field, this data, and this employee. Now I'm going to put this on a new line just to keep it all clear. I'll just add on and continue on to my next line there with that plus symbol there. And I'm going to define which values I'm writing. Now these are also going to be the time, data, and employee. And we will need that semicolon at the end. But these are just fixed strings like I was talking about before. MySQL doesn't know that these are data points. So what I have to do is replace these with the variables I have at the top. And you can see that as soon as I changed it, I can double click this time and it highlights time up there. They're both in the black text, so they're both referring to the same value. I'll do the same with data. I'll just double click it and then press the quote key to put it in quotes, and then surround it with pluses to stick this in there. I'll do the same thing with employee, just pressing the quote key to separate out that extra string. Now I can see that employee is a separate value that I'm sticking in this RIO dev rather than the string employee without any tick marks around it, because that would be referring to this field here, this last column. So now I have my insert statement put together. We just need to assign that to message.topic and return this whole message with that nice insert statement put together. So now while that's configured, I'll come up here and say create statement or create insert, and we'll click done. So now I've got my create insert, I've got my database set up, and I've got all my debug nodes. So now I just need to bring it all together. Let's bring this whole read button down and have that be the first one that we test. So I'll drag that out and I can just drop this really easily onto this wire by just coming over it and watching it go dashed. You'll want to make sure it's wired in, but it looks like I'm good to go. I'll also need another database node, but I can just select that and press Ctrl-C to copy it, and Ctrl-V to again paste it right on the wire. And we can see everything's all hooked up now. So we're going to read the button, create the insert based on the message.payload that comes in, and then that will be written to the database. So let's test this one first. I'll enable this debug node, clean up my debug pane, and hit deploy. Right away we should see an entry come through, but it looks like I've gotten a typo here. Management. Now if you do have typos like this in your configuration, MySQL is not going to know that, and the database is not going to work. But this is a really easy fix. I'll just come back into my function node, put in the extra character I missed, and that should now be a correct insert statement. It's okay to have bad insert statements, because if it's a bad statement, MySQL simply will not execute it. You have to have valid transact SQL before it'll work. But you don't want to play too much with this without consulting your database administrator or IT team first, because you could do some damage, for example, removing data that you didn't intend to. So tread carefully, but don't worry about small mistakes like that. I'll go ahead and click done, and we'll try this one more time. Deploy, we'll see we've connected, and we've inserted into our database. So now if I drop this down, we'll see we've affected one row. It looks like it all worked perfectly. So just to prove it actually worked, I'm going to come back to my database console. Once I'm in the console, I'm going to type out select star from management. Star is just a wildcard that says select everything you can find without limitations. I'll press enter, and yeah, we'll see we've got one entry right in here that says we've gotten the data false, saying the store is closed. So let's come back into Node-RED. Let's press the button, and we should see that, yep, and we've got another affected row here, and if we come back to our console log and run that command again, just pressing the up arrow and hitting enter, there we go, we've got two entries now. One false, and then another for true when I entered it. We'll do it one more time to get that turned off. And right away, it's pretty much instantaneous. So let's go back here and do the same thing with temperature. But of course, this isn't going to happen on the button press, it'll just happen every 15 seconds. This one's really easy to do. We'll just grab this flow and drag it down here. And all we have to do is put in another copy of that developer database node. The next thing we'll need to do is grab this function, Control-C and Control-V again. Let's drop that in. And what's cool is because we're using a dynamic entry here where we're just putting the payload in, it doesn't matter whether our payload is the temperature or the button press or anything else, we can use this exact same configuration. If you did want to change something like make it from a different employee or perhaps modify the data somehow, you could do that here as well, but I'm just going to leave everything the same just to show you that works. So I'll click done. Now the last thing we need is the database node. I'll again copy that, place it in, and let's stretch this out a little bit more. And there we go, we can see it's wired in now, we've got this full chain. So now let's clear up the debug pane, click deploy, and we'll see that it'll start injecting, and so every 15 seconds we'll see this come through and create our entries. So our first one here, as you can see even in the red here, that's our topic, that's our insert statement. We've got insert into management, time, data, employee, and the values. That's our timestamp there in milliseconds, not nanoseconds. We've got our value false and our employee of RIO dev here. Then you can see 15 seconds later we do insert into management, the time, the data, and the employee, and this time we have our nice temperature value in there. And we affected one row, so if we go back into our database and we choose to select star again, we'll see there we go. We've already gotten 2 more entries, and I did redeploy, so we've gotten some extra falses in there as well. So there we go. Now we're bringing in this temperature data every 15 seconds, and we're also able to log this button whenever an event happens, whenever it changes state. We're not seeing true or false every 15 seconds, only as often it has changed. But if I refresh my select here again, we'll see every 15 seconds I'm getting this value, this temperature value in. And of course, if I were to grab it and increase that temperature, and then make another select within 15 seconds, we'll see the temperature increase. This is going to give us a nice time series log of the temperature so that you know what it's been the whole time that the program is running. Selecting again, there we go. It didn't increase much, but it's up 0.3 degrees just from me holding it for a couple of seconds. So, using a couple of basic bits of Transact SQL and a little bit of time configuring, as well as working with your database team or your IT team, it's really easy to get data off of your groov, RIO, or your groov epic and into a database so that you can reference it later, bring it back into Node-RED, analyze it, or do whatever else you need.